Hello and welcome to Conversations. I'm Jim Below, your host. Very pleased to have joining me today Raymond Hess, the Transportation Manager for Ann Arbor, if that's the title that you have now officially.
That is indeed.
And I say officially because you're now been with Ann Arbor for what, about 3 months?
Yeah, just going on just over 2 months at the city, actually.
Okay.
So I moved here a week or so before then, but yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, welcome first to Ann Arbor, and now to get a better idea for the people in Ann Arbor of what you do and what the city's transportation management occurs. How did you get into the sort of transportation and transportation management? What's your background, and how did you get to Ann Arbor?
Well, before I begin, thanks for having me on the show. I'm very delighted to be here, very delighted to be in Ann Arbor as well. So my family and I are super excited to be part of the community. So I moved out here from Las Vegas. I actually was Director of Planning Services for the Regional Transportation Commission out there. And the Regional Transportation Commission is the transit provider, like the ride.
Right.
It is the Metropolitan Planning Organization. Here locally, that's WATS, or the Washington Ohio Area Transportation Study. We're the Traffic Management Center, so we controlled all of the lights and signals.
Okay.
And then we also did other travel demand management, things like that, to encourage people to walk and bike and things of that nature. And so I was over all of the long-term planning forecasting things, so the Metropolitan Planning Organization, and we managed some of the federal funding that came, and then we did the long-range transportation forecasts.
And Las Vegas is, I would assume, a much larger community.
It is indeed, yeah. It's
Right.
about 2.2 million people.
Yep.
And we were a regional government, so we worked with all the local jurisdictions. We worked with the State Department of Transportation, the Federal Highway Administration. But yeah, we worked pretty collaboratively across those jurisdictions.
And now with Ann Arbor, it's not only is it smaller, but I would think it's more focused on the immediate needs, you might say, of the people within Ann Arbor, as well as looking at the region, but really it's more, I would think, focusing in Ann Arbor.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm working with the city, obviously, on city transportation issues. Before I was in Las Vegas, I actually was in Bloomington, Indiana,
Okay.
so another college town. Worked on a lot of different transportation issues out there, including bicycle pedestrian, as well as long-range planning. And so there are some similarities between my work in Bloomington and some of the work that I foresee doing here. But I think I'm still on that learning curve, a steep learning curve at that. A lot of what I'm working on right now is getting ready for the school year, both in terms of the university as well as the school district, and kind of just how transportation and traffic changes with those needs.
You mentioned all this related to transportation. As a young child, did you think, gee, I want to grow up to deal with cars and bicycles and pedestrians, or how did you get into this area of public service, public management?
So I kind of fell into the profession of planning in general by accident. So I was in the Peace Corps. I was in Cote d'Ivoire, West Africa. When I came back, I was looking for a job, and then landed a job with a small community in Florida, north of Tampa, a little town called Brooksville. And that's where I got introduced to the world of planning. And we were a small department. We were a department of like 3 people. And I did everything from zoning and long-range comprehensive planning to transportation planning, economic development planning. And that was kind of my role. And I really fell in love with kind of the multidisciplinary aspect of planning and really kind of problem solving some of the issues that face a community. Then when I moved to Bloomington, it was to pursue my master's degree in public affairs, and I did transportation planning while I was out there, and I had a focus on bicycle pedestrian planning, and then ultimately regional planning. And so my first love was with planning, and then I kind of developed a specialty in transportation and been doing transportation for the last 12 plus years, and very much enjoy it because transportation is something that affects everyone's life, whether you're driving, whether you're walking, whether you're biking, whether you're taking the bus. Everybody needs to get around. And
I was saying, in planning in general, one key aspect of planning is how do you get people in and out and make use of land area and development of land, and how it's going to impact the people there, but also the people wanting to go through the area, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I see here in Ann Arbor, I've heard that in a community of 120,000 people, we have 80,000 people that come to the community every day to work, and so that's kind of an impressive strain or a challenge that it puts on our system. And then you couple that with when you have events at the big house and some other game day activities where you literally double your population, and how you move people around the area safely and efficiently, I think is kind of an interesting situation that you have here in Ann Arbor, and I'm still learning how we do things. It's an exciting process. And as a matter of fact, my first game was the Manchester United
Right.
versus Liverpool.
I would say
and
you
so,
have a little bit of an
yeah.
experience of a week of
Yeah.
dealing with special needs and special demands and
Yeah.
People who don't know the city and get lost, but also how to get them all to one concentrated area.
Right. So one of the aspects of my team is the signs and signals group, and so they're out there helping manage traffic and getting traffic kind of into the core area when they want to get, and then when the game lets out, for example, getting them back onto the freeways. And so it's an interesting dynamic. People probably don't appreciate all the different things that go on behind the scenes. Everything from putting out the cones and the barricades to switching the roads to one way, getting out of town. To making sure that traffic moves as efficiently as possible and changing even the signal timing at some of the traffic lights.
Now, you mentioned you've been in Ann Arbor for just under 3 months.
Yep.
So you've not experienced, you could say, the city with 40,000 students either living or coming and going. You mentioned you could say, survive the soccer match.
Yeah.
But between university students, the school year, and all that, how do you begin to look at those issues, and what kind of special issues first with a university, because you were in Bloomington, what are some special issues with students that you sort of look out for?
Sure. So I think one of the things we always want to be mindful of is the safety of all the traveling public, and it doesn't matter what mode of travel they use, whether it's by car, by foot, by bus, by bike, making sure that we have as safe an infrastructure as possible to accommodate people. The other thing, too, is really looking at how do we move people as opposed to how do we just move cars, because some people aren't driving, either they can't drive or they choose not to. And so how do we make sure that we give people transportation choices? And especially in a college town like Ann Arbor, you do see a greater percentage of the population that tend to walk or bike. And so if you look at what we call mode split, the typical modes that people choose and how much of the population is using walking, biking, or bus in particular, those tend to be higher percentages than you would find in other communities in Michigan or even across the United States. And so making sure that we really provide a lot of options and multimodal, that you have several choices to get to your destination that are seamless and efficient to get there and safe to get there. I think that's really the challenge that we have before us, and we're always trying to figure out better ways to move people around to get them to their destinations where they're going.
You mentioned the concern about getting people to destinations, which gets into the looking at Ann Arbor of identifying what those destinations might be.
Sure.
Not just university destinations,
right.
but work destinations.
Right.
If 80,000 or so are coming into the city from outside, that's moving to in most cases, a specific destination.
Right.
What type of factors, other than how wide a road should be and be able to move as much traffic, but as you say, not everyone's driving.
Right. So it's about moving people. I think for a long time in the transportation profession, we were only interested in moving traffic. And there's a whole science in terms of how we measure that and how we've built roads to accommodate that. But there are other ways to move people as opposed to just cars. And if you look at transit, you look at how efficient our transit system is, both the ride and the university system. Think about how many people you can fit on a bus. It depends on what size bus. But think about how many people can move through a corridor if they're on a bus versus a single person in an automobile. And so that's really how we need to think about things. Same things with pedestrian. We have pedestrian crossings here that hundreds of students will cross that pedestrian crossing within an hour, if not thousands. And so really finding a way to really kind of balance those needs. And then cycling too. We're trying to put in new bicycling infrastructure. With partners like the Downtown Development Authority and the university and others to make sure that we give people those options to connect to those places they want to go.
Let's look, you mentioned first the pedestrian. Ann Arbor over the last couple of years has had an ongoing discussion concerning pedestrian crossings.
Yes.
And to what extent they are both identified and to what extent are they provided with extra safety through whether it be flashing lights, whether it be with stop signs, whatever. In your experience in both a large city like Las Vegas, another community like Ann Arbor and Bloomington, what are there different ways of helping, you say, ensure safety, but at the same time providing the traffic flow so that a car in front of the Michigan Union at State and South U isn't sitting there for 10 minutes because the transportation of pedestrians crossing is nonstop.
Right. So, I think one of the things I'm very happy to see is Ann Arbor is doing a lot of the things that I think really are considered best practice. If you look at, for example, some of the enhancements made to crosswalks throughout the community, we have those yellow pedestrian signs with the lights in them. We call those rectangular rapid flashing beacons, or RRFBs for short. So it really alerts motorists of the presence of pedestrians and making sure that there's some added visibility so that everyone can be safe. We want the motorists to be safe. We want pedestrians to be safe. So it's, again, safety is kind of paramount for all of our considerations. And the profession evolves over time. Some of these new materials and signage came online in recent years, and so we're always trying to kind of use kind of what we think would be best suited for our needs. And then again, in terms of trying to balance what the needs are of how we move people around. When we have traffic where you have kind of these intersections of where pedestrians are and vehicles and bicyclists and transit users, just making sure that we kind of can accommodate all those and balance those to the greatest degree possible.
And as with, I would assume in Bloomington more than Las Vegas, the assumption that pedestrians have the right of way wherever they're crossing the street. It does seem as if they believe they can cross, not just at crosswalks, but especially down on campus, that wherever they decide to, the car is supposed to stop for them. And that is not always going to be the case. Dealing with both the law, but also the reality of not everyone looking and being aware of what's, you could say, in front of them.
Right. So, I think that, as I understand it, Motor Vehicle Code does specify where pedestrians have the right of way.
Right.
And so this is both marked and unmarked crosswalks.
Yeah.
So, I think there's a pretty clear understanding if a crosswalk is marked that the pedestrian has the right of way. But keep in mind that any time two roads intersect, you have an intersection where there is an implied crosswalk, even if it isn't marked. So just keeping in mind, who has the right of way, and ultimately, I say everyone should be cautious when they're out there, whether it's pedestrians, whether it's motorists. Is that one extra second that you might save by going, faster or not being attentive? Is it worth, putting someone's life in jeopardy?
The distractions are now not just with the driver, but with headphones and with cell phones and everything. Both anyone involved in walking, bicycling, driving is potentially being distracted, right, where that split second can be critical and well-being.
Yeah, it's just imperative that everyone remain alert out there and be safe and just kind of observe the rules of the road.
We're going to take a short break, come back. I want to talk about bicycle and sort of what Ann Arbor is doing, but also what it potentially might be doing in the future. Ask our viewers to stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment.
CTN Sports, bringing local sports to you.
We want everyone in Ann Arbor to be safe, which is why Ann Arbor has a law requiring drivers to be 5 feet while passing bicyclists, pedestrians, or wheelchairs traveling on the road. Most traffic lanes within the city are at least 10 feet wide, so give half a lane width of space for safety's sake. This is a good way to measure how much space is required. And if it isn't safe to pass, don't. Be cautious, be patient, and most of all, be safe.
Hello and welcome back to Conversations. I'm speaking today with Raymond Hess, the transportation manager for the city of Ann Arbor. And Ann Arbor is, I think, many communities, and especially I would think college communities, bicycling and alternative modes of transportation other than the car and walking are big. And right now Ann Arbor seems to have, say, an increase in bicycle lanes where there's dedicated space. There was I think last year, the year before, a local ordinance about how far you have to be away from the bicyclist. There's also efforts within Washtenaw County to make through a pathway or ability to bicycle through the whole county.
Yeah.
From your perspective, how good is Ann Arbor at looking at and providing bicycle opportunities? And are there new or different things that we're beginning to look at?
Sure. So, again, I mentioned earlier about how the transportation profession kind of changes over time, and cycling is one of those areas of the profession that is changing. In the past, there was kind of an inkling to try to accommodate the strong and fearless cyclist. So this is kind of the road warrior, and there are obviously people that bicycle that really don't need any special type of infrastructure. However, some of the latest thinking is that how can we address the interested but concerned? That there are people out there who might bike, but are too concerned with the conditions out there on the roadway. We can take myself as an example. I'm a pretty confident cyclist, but when I have my 6-year-old daughter with me, there are probably certain roads I wouldn't want to bike on. Yeah. And so right now, the profession is really starting to look at how can we put in facilities that are comfortable no matter how old you are, how strong your ability is to bicycle, and keep you in a place where you feel comfortable riding. And so the different things that are now being considered, even here in Ann Arbor that you've probably seen, we had in the past bicycle lanes, which is simply just a single stripe on the road with a little bike icon in it. Now we're moving towards buffered bicycle lanes. And so the idea is that you add another stripe that gives a little bit of buffer between the bicyclist and the motor vehicle. So then that way it provides even that much more kind of...
I've not seen those. How much space is there between the two lines for the most part?
So it depends on how much room we have, okay, I think, ultimately. Our newest ones that we put in are on North Maple. You'll see that we did a road conversion out there, and so that enabled us to put in buffered bike lanes. And so they vary from place to place, but you probably want them at about 2 feet wide as that buffer, 2 to 3 feet wide.
And so in certain ways, it's just extending the bicycle lane indirectly by another foot or two.
Right. And typically what you can do is you can kind of hash that out to kind of show that it's a no man's land, for lack of a better term, that it's not really a place for cyclists or for cars, but it gives that added buffer. Yeah. The next thing that is kind of the next on the hierarchy is protected bicycle lanes. And protected bicycle lanes have some sort of physical separation above and beyond just paint. So it's something above ground. It could be something as simple as these little plastic delineator, those little breakaway bollards. It could be planter boxes. It could be any number of treatments. And so you are starting to see those in other communities.
I'm saying in Detroit, I know they have that in
Exactly.
certain areas where, especially in the more commercial areas where they're encouraging bicyclists to come into the shopping areas, don't
Exactly.
come outside.
Exactly, and so even the Downtown Development Authority is looking to do those here in downtown, and so they're currently going through a planning process now to identify what the best design is for that on First and Ashley. So that's going to be an exciting development that will have facilities such as those. And then, like you mentioned too, there are always these pathways and trails as well that again give you a high level of comfort, that get you off of the road and can either provide a recreational purpose or a transportation purpose
And
as
then
well.
in some cases, the potential use of that space isn't in conflict with a car, but with pedestrians.
Right.
Because, having been in town long enough before there were any bicycle paths, the whole argument or discussion about, should bicyclists be on sidewalks?
Right.
And if they're on a sidewalk, if there's not space on the road, who has the right of way then on a sidewalk?
Right.
And, I know in certain areas the pathways are getting wider to provide both space for pedestrian and bicycles the same way as on our street.
Yeah, I think that's the primary consideration, that if you do have a shared space with cyclists and pedestrians, you want to make sure it's wide enough for both of them to operate safely. And then, quite frankly, I think the bigger question that needs to be asked is, really the why. Why are bicyclists riding on the sidewalk? And it might be because they don't feel safe bicycling in the roadway, even if there is a bike lane. Sometimes I've heard from folks in the 2 months that I've been here, there's a bike lane right there. Why aren't they riding on it? Well, maybe they don't feel comfortable, or maybe there's debris in there, or whatever the case may be. There might be reasons, and so really understanding those reasons, I think, will help us define and develop the best network that Ann Arbor can have.
In looking both short-term and long-term, as a transportation manager, where would you place Ann Arbor now as far as the ability to move people and transport people in a variety, and what are your short and long-term goals in improving that?
That's a loaded question,
I know.
isn't it? So, I think, again, when we look at the full picture, right, I know there are people who are stuck in traffic who would probably say, there's a lot of room for improvement. And there's always going to be room for improvement. But I would say, if you look at the big picture, we look at how many people we move by bus. I've been taking the bus pretty regularly to work, and I'm just amazed at how many people use it. And part of that is because we have a really good system. And so in a lot of these types of systems, it really is about, build it and they will come, or provide that transportation and they will come. So if you provide a really good transit service, people will use transit. If you provide a really good bicycling network, people will use it. If you provide a really good road network, people will drive. And if you provide a really good pedestrian environment, people will walk. So really trying to figure out what we want to do to accommodate the growth that's expected to come. We can't really build our way out of congestion. This is kind of a mantra in the transportation profession that, you reach a certain point where you can't build roads any wider, right? Especially in a place like Ann Arbor that's a pretty much built up environment. So we need to think about how do we move people more efficiently without double-decking our freeway, which we don't want, right?
And in looking at that, in a city like Ann Arbor that many of us would still view as fairly small but growing, different areas of town have, you say, different needs. And it goes back to where people will complain about the traffic jam in downtown Ann Arbor every morning and afternoon. The business owners, they're loving the fact that traffic goes slowly by their businesses.
Right.
And so you have to balance the needs and desires of different, you could say, people.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Yeah. In Vegas, for example, the highest real estate is on Las Vegas Boulevard. Well, if you've ever driven down Las Vegas Boulevard, it's a crawl, right?
Yeah.
And so that goes to show kind of balancing those needs of how do we move people but yet still make an area viable.
You mentioned Las Vegas, and one area that you say you're involved in is you could say the whole region area. What have you learned so far, both within Washtenaw County of efforts dealing with movement of people, but also Southeast Michigan and the ongoing discussion of mass transit in Southeast Michigan?
Sure. So I know there have been a lot of discussions about kind of a regional transit authority, which was, as I understand it, supported pretty strongly here in Washtenaw, but then wasn't supported in other counties. And so I think that dialogue is still ongoing. I think there's still a hope to see if that can move forward. And based on the past, I think the folks or the good people of Washtenaw would support that. I know there's interest I just met with some professionals over in Detroit, and they are still interested in moving that along as well. So I think there is regional support for it, and it's really just trying to figure out kind of the best mix to make that happen. The other thing that I'm really excited about is, this area, in particular Ann Arbor, seems really mindful of, this concept of complete streets, that a street is meant to, as I've said earlier, kind of address all needs of all users. And so really looking at how we can best accommodate that, I think, is front and center of a lot of the mindset of the people that I work with, and that's very, very refreshing.
And one of the things in mentioning that has been ongoing is the issue of areas of town that don't have sidewalks.
Yeah.
Areas of town where the roads are so narrow because they're so old do you allow parking or not?
Right.
And, can you provide space for whether it be bicyclists or traffic both ways, where there's a, parking on one side or the other.
Yeah, and it's all about those trade-offs, right? And so, on-street parking can sometimes have a traffic calming effect. And so if there are issues with speed or things like that, maintaining that on-street parking can be desirable. But if there aren't other ways of getting around, maybe looking at using that space in a different way might be desirable. And so really what we try to do, and again, being here 2 months, just seeing how my colleagues approach the issue, it's really about trying to identify what the needs are and the desires are of that neighborhood or that region in the greater context.
But also education of the community as a whole.
Definitely.
I mean, the whole discussion of Huron Street and whether or not reducing the number of lanes actually may help movement of traffic.
Right.
As opposed to the general initial thought is if you reduce the number of lanes, you're putting more cars into fewer lanes and it's going to be worse.
Yeah, so it depends, right? So there's a concept called a road diet, that if you have 2 lanes of traffic in each direction, there's a lot of studies out there that suggest if you put 1 lane in each direction with a center turn lane, you can actually move that corridor along more efficiently. And part of the reason for that, and it's safer, part of the reason for that is if you think about those 2 lanes in each direction, if one of those lanes wants to turn left, that whole lane is backed up. If a bus stops in the right lane or someone else stops in the right lane, then that whole lane is blocked up. So you could have both lanes blocked up at any given time, or even worse, you have weaving. This car is going to turn left, so they sweeve here, they see a bus, they weave here. Whereas if you have kind of this more predictable environment, it's safer and you can move more people. And so it is something that we've been applying, again, before I got here, but it's something that you're seeing around town, those conversions.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us today and welcome officially to Ann Arbor.
Thank you.
And having been in transportation long enough, you realize that no matter what you do, someone's going to complain.
We're not doing our job then, right?
Well, thank you again.
Yes.
Look forward to your work and effort here in Ann Arbor.
Great. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. I want to thank our viewers for joining us today and look forward to your continued support here on Conversations. Thank you.